Hello and welcome to the Free Speech Nation podcast with me, Andrew Doyle. Today I am delighted to welcome my guest, Emma Webb. Emma is a broadcaster, a commentator, formerly the Deputy Research Director at the Free Speech Union. She's done a lot of work with the New Culture Forum, and she's also the co-founder of Save Our Statues, which is a heritage campaigning organisation. We discussed a lot of things during our conversation, including free speech, the nature of the culture war and how it is so linguistically motivated, and what we can do to get ourselves out of the quagmire of the counter-enlightenment. I hope you enjoy it. Emma, thanks so much for joining me today. There are so many things I want to talk to you about, but let's start with a bit about you, because I think a lot of people won't know about your background and how you got into commentary, broadcasting, all of those kind of things. How did you start?
I actually started working in Westminster at the Henry Jackson Society pretty much straight out of university. And I started by doing research in their Centre on Radicalisation and Terrorism. So I was actually looking at particularly Islamist extremism, how they build institutions, how they create networks, and basically how they build the power of their own platforms. And then I ended up going from that to working at Civitas, which is the Institute for the Study of Civil Society, which is also in Westminster, another think tank, where I was looking at issues of the sort of intersection between extremism and Islamism with other issues like integration and free speech. And that was at the time that the whole Islamophobia debate was kicking off. And so that was kind of my way into working in Westminster. And then from there on to working for the Free Speech Union. And I began to become more involved with sort of writing and commentating and doing various things in broadcast as well. But
you must have been very young to be going into these kind of very heavy ideas. Was there something that stimulated you as a young person to think that's the topic I want to tackle? I was
fascinated by the ways that ideas made people behave. And when I was at university and I was studying theology, I realized that the idea that ideas make people behave in any kind of way, particularly religious ideas, was absolutely not in vogue, that people didn't really give that any credit anymore. Everything was influenced by economics or, other circumstances, power structures and everything, but the intellectual world didn't really have much clout. And that was something that I was always interested in. And then I discovered all of these Islamist preachers who were sort of frequenting British universities. I'd go to different universities around the country and I'd watch them speak. And then I just ended up getting sort of really drawn into sort of fascination with this particular Islamist network within the United Kingdom and also in Europe, and going and, watching them preach and collecting their literature. And that was how I ended up sort of sliding into working for the Henry Jackson Society.
Because that's very interesting, isn't it? There was a period, which is still going on to a degree, where there is a kind of denialism about the influence of theocracy when it comes to, or the motivations of terrorist activity. And you would see things like someone, screams Allahu Akbar before exploding themselves, and people say, we never know what the motive is. Or someone screams, this is for Islam, and they say, but we can't work out why this person did this. Well, they told you, so surely it's not just geopolitics. It's not just radicalization. There is certainly a religious motivation, isn't there?
I've always thought that it is important to listen to what people are actually telling you about what they believe. And this is something that, was said by Holocaust survivors about the Nazis, that when somebody tells you they want to kill you, you ought to believe them. So when someone tells you they're doing something for a particular reason, it matters that they believe that. It doesn't matter whether you think that they have theologically or philosophically sophisticated views.
Yes.
That bears absolutely no relationship to how deeply they hold those views. And one example that I always like to go to is of two brothers who were involved in Islamic State. And one of the reasons that they stated, that was published in one of the Islamic State propaganda magazines, for why they went and joined ISIS was because they had dreams in prison about Muhammad visiting them on a white horse and essentially telling them that they needed to go into battle for Islam. And I think that it's interesting, it's intellectually interesting, but it's also important for understanding what these movements are. And I think very little credit is given to the influence of the intellectual landscape and different zeitgeists when understanding how our history unfolds, and particularly understanding the present, because especially right now, ideas matter so much in our politics, and it's important that we, give them the credit that they deserve.
So when you talk about Islamic extremism specifically, there is a counter argument. We understand why connecting it to the religion, people would be reticent to do so, because it invites, I suppose, an Islamophobic backlash. There are people who will throw bacon at mosques, or who will tear a hijab off a woman on the street. There are these unpleasant people that behave in these unpleasant ways. And I suppose the argument is that if you connect terrorism to a faith, then you embolden that kind of behavior. Do you take that on board?
I think it's one of the... when we often talk about cancel culture and things, I think this is one of the original sensitivities, because Islamism is Islamism. All right, you can't remove the religious aspect from it. It is a socio-political movement. It is a very distinct phenomenon that is separate from Islam, but is informed by Islam.
Yeah.
And that is obviously going to cause some difficulties and sensitivities. And there are some people who have said that we shouldn't be calling it Islamism, but the problem is, what else do you call it? Because that is the most accurate description of what it is. And it has its own intellectual history. It has its own intellectual giants within it, people like Said Qutb. And it is a very distinct thing, and it's not something that should be conflated. And I think that understanding it, and as many have done, as being one of the totalitarian political movements of the 20th and of the 21st century, is a very important way of understanding it. And obviously that's going to create some kind of confusion, but that's another reason why it's important to make it clear that this is a distinct political movement, and it has a complicated relationship to Islam as a religion, but there's no getting around that, unfortunately.
I'm very interested as well in which these sort of extremist moments in our history seem to be tied to this idea of offense culture. And I remember even you will know about it, but you'll be too young to remember it, when the Salman Rushdie affair occurred. And I remember seeing interviews on TV where people were saying, well, he shouldn't have caused offence, it's his fault. Even my Christian theology teacher at school said, well, if you're going to insult someone's religion, you get what you deserve. This was actually people forget that this was a very commonly held view, that this esteemed, brilliant novelist was to blame, and we shouldn't be forking out to protect him from theocrats who wanted his head. I mean, this is... But it was the seeds of what we now see as cancel culture, I suppose.
Yeah, and that kind of victim blaming approach to
use modern parlance,
exactly, to steal a term, is still going on. If you remember what happened after the murder of Samuel Paty, and leaders around the world like Imran Khan in Pakistan or Erdogan in Turkey were calling for a boycott of France and accusing the French and Macron of being Islamophobic for allowing these cartoons to be shown, for allowing them to be published. Charlie Hebdo were also accused of being Islamophobic, and it became a justification for why they were attacked. And in that way, very often the term Islamophobia gets used simply as a byword for blasphemy. It gets used as a way of silencing people, either silencing people who are criticising, as I say, Islamism as a political movement and the activities of that political movement, not people who are explicitly criticising Islam. Not that there would be anything wrong with criticising Islam, but those criticisms are very often branded as Islamophobic, and that becomes a justification for, in the case of following Samuel Paty's death, boycotts, but sometimes could be used as a justification for attacks. And there's a lot of complex things going on there, but it's quite clear that what happened to Salman Rushdie is still something. We saw it with the Danish cartoon affair, we saw it with Charlie Hebdo, and as you say, often the people who end up getting attacked for these things, sometimes it's fatal. They very often get blamed just because they have said something that other people find offensive, rather than educating people that is not an appropriate way to respond if you feel offended.
Right. I mean, well, we never seem to learn, though. This is the problem. Every time one of these things happens, there is a debate about the extent to which the victim deserved it, or the extent to which they provoked. And actually, surely the point is that even if they had deliberately set out to provoke, even if they wanted to insult Islam, in a free society, that's their right. As it happens, that wasn't the case with Charlie Hebdo. I mean, that's a massive misunderstanding. But why do we never learn from this? And why can we not resolve this among ourselves?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think it's a really difficult one, and I think we're seeing a similar thing now with all sorts of other categories of modern blasphemy, whether it's to do with gender critical feminists and the trans debate, whether it's to do with Black Lives Matter and race and decolonization. I think that the West has been suffering a kind of identity crisis for a very long time now, and postmodernism, relativism, cultural and moral relativism has set everyone's head spinning, and we no longer know exactly how to respond to these things, and the way that language is used has become so slippery and so changeable, and so magic in many ways, that it's becoming increasingly difficult to even have the sorts of conversations that you would need to have in order to resolve the underlying philosophical difficulties that we're facing.
So let's talk about that a little more, because I feel that a lot of the culture war is really about language and about having to, because in order to get to the arguments, the hub of the arguments, you first have to negotiate the linguistic minefield that has been set by activists. So you think that a term means one thing. You think that to be anti-racist means to be opposed to racism, which we all are. And then you find that, no, it doesn't mean that. It means a new form of discourse that says you are either racist or anti-racist, and that to be not racist is a form of racism. Right, so simply not to be racist. That's directly from Ibram X. Kendi. He's explicitly said that. So that, in other words, we find ourselves in a position where, in order to oppose racism, you have to also oppose anti-racism, and people can't make sense of this because the language has been, because activists keep redefining words and denying that they are redefining words.
It's almost a trap.
Yes,
There's no way that you can wiggle out of it, because things have lost their original meaning, and you see the same thing with the whole debate around what a woman is, and the fact that we have a Labour Party that just simply cannot state what a woman is.
Rishi Sunak struggled the other day.
Everybody struggles, and it's become the ultimate gotcha question that politicians are now absolutely terrified, jump behind the couch, afraid whenever anybody mentions the word woman, because they know that they're going to be asked a question that they know the answer to, but they know they can't say that is the answer. Yeah. And it's like the old Orwellian 2 + 2 = 5. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? You have to say something that you believe is untrue because of the mess of language tripwires that have been laid around you. And I think that the perfect example of this is the whole story around the Conservative MP who's come out as trans but is not going to do anything to change his biology.
This is Jamie Wallace.
He's still going to be using his male pronouns, his biological gender.
Yes.
And then he has come out criticising the government for not including trans in their conversion therapy ban. But that itself was a spin, because conversion therapy, when referring to homosexuals, refers to trying to change somebody's sexual orientation from one thing to another. But when it's being used in reference to trans people, it's essentially referring to a ban on anything other than simply affirming somebody's self-identification. Yeah. And this criticism is coming from a man who is self-identifying as a woman, but is actually not doing anything to change his gender in any ways that would typically be recognized as going along the journey to becoming a trans person.
Yes.
So the whole thing is just an absolute mess. And I think the reason one of the reasons why we've got ourselves into this situation in the first place is because we just simply haven't been able to have the conversations, because we've wrapped ourselves in so many layers of censorship and so many tripwires that the important conversations that needed to happen, our ability to even simply state the truth, is now completely lost on us.
It might be worth outlining precisely what's happened with this conversion therapy debate, because the government were going to pass a bill saying they were going to ban conversion therapy. But within that was conflated the kind of conversion therapy you describe, where you are trying to change a homosexual person's sexual orientation by whatever it means, by whatever therapeutic means, brainwashing, whatever that might be. And that is conflated with pediatricians, say, who have a child come to them who has gender dysphoria or is confused about their gender, asking why this might be, trying to interrogate it a bit, trying to work out whether this has come about through internalized homophobia, through abuse, through whatever it might be, rather than just affirming, yes, you are whatever you say you are. And that's Those two things are incredibly different, and they've both been called conversion therapy.
Again, it is this way of using language in a slippery way to package things up that don't belong together, and it's actually, I think, a very risky thing to describe that as conversion therapy, because gender dysphoria is a very complicated thing that isn't properly understood, and it's also something that is extremely disputed. And setting people down a medical pathway and excluding from them any of the clinical alternatives, so possibly seeking some kind of therapy to deal with your gender dysphoria if that's what you prefer, rather than going down the medical and the chemical route, that should not be described as conversion therapy. And it's an injustice to the original meaning of conversion therapy. And we see this also with some trans people who feel very uncomfortable being lumped in with all of these new bizarre genders and orientations that have come on the scene. And you see this with, I've seen this myself with people who will identify themselves as being I think the terms you'll be more familiar than I am, grey ace, grey asexual, and demi, which essentially is it strikes me as that is just a normal the most common form of sexuality.
Demisexual would be isn't demisexual someone who involves themselves in heterosexual relationships so long as there is a romantic element to
which is the majority of people.
In other words, old-fashioned heterosexual.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is now under the queer bracket.
And all of these identities then get lumped in together with some of the stranger ones, and sometimes in with kinks and all sorts of things. And then you will have trans people, public trans people like Blair White, for example, who really I imagine would probably feel quite offended to have their identity as lumped in with all of these other things, as if somehow these things are all in some kind of alliance with each other. And it ignores all of the tensions between these things as well and tries to gloss over them, which is how we've ended up in this whole problem with the sex and gender debate, because the assumption was that with intersectionality that there must be an alliance there, when actually there's a tension between gender and sex when it comes to rights.
And this is very interesting in terms of the LGBT community, because within that you have this conflation of completely different causes. And that might be causing the problems. Often people will say, well, those who have concerns about, say, the Tavistock Clinic or gender clinics for children are the same as homophobes from the 70s who said it's just a phase. And these are completely different things. But the conflation is a trick, is a kind of, and it's interesting. The phrase conversion therapy in itself carries a very weighty implication, which is that you are being transformed from something that you are innately. You are being converted. So in homosexuality, you'll be converted from your homosexual nature into a heterosexual nature. But when it comes to gender identity, well, for a start, gender ideologues often claim it's not fixed, that it's something that is malleable. And here they are saying, at the same time, if a child says they are something, then they always have been, and that is fixed. So there's no coherence within the logical framework that they propose.
The whole thing is completely confused. And actually, I think there was an interesting article, I believe it was by Lucy Bannerman in the Times about this, where she pointed out that because these conversations have been happening in secret, basically, with lobby groups like Stonewall gradually rewriting the rules around these things and the ways that we use language, that because these conversations have taken place in secret and with censorship, so anybody who doesn't agree with them is not allowed to take part in the conversation. It means that these inconsistencies in their own argument they just haven't been worked out, and it goes to show the importance of freedom of speech and free debate, because it's actually good for your argument too, that you would have been able to iron out these inconsistencies in your own perspective if you had been in contact with those who didn't entirely agree with you or those who completely disagree with you. And so I think that these things just simply are confused. I think that there isn't a way of making these views flush. They are just confused.
But it might help if we could say, we have lobby groups that protect gay rights. We have lobby groups that protect trans rights, and that we don't conflate the two. But then when the LGB Alliance attempted to do that, people started lying about them and saying they were therefore anti-trans. No, they're just dealing with a specific issue that isn't related to the other issue. This strikes me as very simple.
And these things need to be balanced as well. People's rights need to be balanced. And it's almost a utopian way of thinking to presume that all of these things must fit with each other perfectly. That's not how society works. It's not how rights work. That, women should be entitled to have their own same-sex protected spaces. That does not mean that you are being transphobic or anti-trans. It doesn't mean that you don't believe that trans people also deserve equal rights and to be treated with dignity as human beings. But it doesn't mean that those rights get to impose on somebody else's rights to be protected and to be safe.
Yeah.
And that those conversations should be censored in such a way that in the trans debate, particularly in the case of women, that their voices throughout have been completely ignored and have been smeared and have been tarred as being transphobic and therefore not having a valid point to make. I think that we need to move past this idea of intersectionality and of the idea that all of these minority groups have sort of shared interests in that respect, that actually there may be tensions there. Those rights have to be balanced, and it doesn't mean that we don't believe that some people should be deprived of their rights, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. But any kind of attempt to have a debate is interpreted as a form of hatred, as a form of bigotry. I know there are people out there who hate or have prejudice towards trans people, but I've never met them. They're not very commonplace. But if you listen to Owen Jones and people like that, you would believe that this country is awash with them. Why do they make such an infantile interpretation of perfectly legitimate questions?
I think most people have a very live and let live approach to all of these things, and that even if you could disagree with somebody's sexual behaviour, it doesn't mean that you don't believe that they should have equal rights. And we've seen this as well around the whole debate relating, particularly in Finland, the use of the Finnish politician who had tweeted I believe she tweeted a Bible verse, and that had been an ongoing case that has finally been resolved and she's been vindicated. But even the language of sin has become problematic, that Christians are concerned that they can't even talk about their own traditional or orthodox doctrines because even those things have become verboten. And I think most people do have a live and let live approach.
Yes.
And ultimately I just think that when people like Owen Jones and others want to straw man the people who disagree with them, if I were being cynical, I would say that was just simply about power. That's just simply about excluding those people from the debate because it's in the interest of their argument to do so. Although I think ultimately it isn't in the interest of their argument to do so. I think everybody benefits from free debate, but then, as you say, debate itself has been cast as something that is white supremacist.
Yes.
And people like Robin DiAngelo, democracy, meritocracy, all of these things that have built an enlightened, open, free, liberal society, all of these things are now white supremacist and must be done away with. And I think there are so many aspects of this that can be picked out that are extremely complicated and difficult. But I think ultimately, to be cynical, those who say that everything is about power, I think often with them, everything is about power. Well,
sure. I mean, that's a difficult one, isn't it? I always like to assume that people believe what they say. I always like to take people at their word. And the reason for that is I feel that the argument will collapse or will be sustained on its own merit, irrespective of whether they believe it truly or not. But it is difficult to escape the feeling that those, like, exactly as you say, that it feels like a power grab. But is it not possible that people have been so sort of captured by this worldview that they do genuinely see hatred everywhere and they do see these power structures everywhere? I mean, I've read Robin DiAngelo's books. I've read a lot of what Owen Jones writes. I think they mean it. And that's even scarier in a way because it means they've surrendered the capacity for critical thought.
Yeah, and it's a religious worldview. So in a way, you can't reason them out of it because it's closed. It's a closed framework, and everything makes sense within that worldview if you're a part of it. And it's very, very difficult to challenge because things like systemic racism can't be empirically well, the government's race report did essentially debunk it, but people still continue to argue in favour of it, and would say probably that the report itself was
well, they said the report was evidence of systemic racism because it showed that systemic racism.
Precisely, and this is exactly the perfect example of why you can't reason them out of it, and so there isn't a way of rationally discussing the views or the implications of their views, or trying to debunk.
But that raises a huge problem, doesn't it? Because if we are to get anywhere, and if we are to, because I don't believe in writing anyone off, but if there are some people whose entire worldview depends upon the negation of reason, then there is no way actually to engage, is there? I mean, should we just reserve our energy for those who are still capable of discussion and just let the others get on with it?
It's a difficult one. And I think to a degree, simply getting on with the act of debating and discussing and refusing to be pushed around and bullied is the best way to deal with it. Yeah. So a lot of those who don't want to be reasoned with, who don't want to debate, who don't want to have discussions at all with the other side because they believe that the other side are essentially evil, they will try to impose themselves on people to try to get them cancelled, to try to silence them. The Free Speech Union is a perfect example of an organisation that is helping to redress that imbalance. GBNews is another example of something helping to redress that balance because it allows those discussions to take place in a public platform. And those women, for example, like Maya Forstater and Caroline Fisk and others who have stood up and said, actually, we're going to campaign that if you want our vote, then you have to if you want our X, you have to respect our sex, as they were saying. And I think that all of these different movements that are arising, Harry Miller is another one, people who are trying to address these things in the courtroom and through the law. All sorts of organisations are being built up and starting to flourish, and all of these different platforms. And I think simply keeping that Enlightenment spirit of debate alive does a lot of good, and to a degree you can almost let them get on with it.
Well, because they are the minority, right? Because I mean, the More in Common study found that roughly 13% of people in the country would fit into that category of social justice activist intersectional mindset. That's a minority in every age group, right? So that means it's not a question of old people failing to keep up with young people. I mean, you're a good example of this. Young people as well don't support these movements. On the whole. So is it just a case of working around that very vocal, very powerful minority and having these debates so that everyone else can feel they can participate? I
think it's osmosis. You need to make it clear that it is the majority of people who believe in, for example, the traditional ideas of sex rather than gender, that common sense prevails amongst the majority of the population. It's just that the majority of the population has had a less organised voice than the minority of activists who are very good at building institutions and lobbying, or have been so far. And in a sense, the common sense side of the debate is really lagging 20, possibly even 50 years behind those activists. But at least starting to build those platforms goes somewhere. And I think anybody who knows somebody who's woke, particularly in my generation, it's impossible not to know people who would be defined as woke.
Yeah.
You know that it is the golden question. How do you engage with them? Because you can't change someone's mind through reason if you can't talk to them, if they storm out of the room, if they scream at you and call you names and storm off. There's no way to reason with that. And so I think whilst that is the golden question, I think that many people around the country, just simply by being exposed to the existence and the presence of other voices, may see something that piques their interest. They may start to reason through some of the inconsistencies in their own perspective and become more open to other people's views just through at least the possibility of exposure to something other than their own echo chamber. And that in itself, I think, can be very beneficial. But, going back to what we were talking about earlier in relation to Islamism, I am convinced that when people talk about de-radicalization, it sounds like a very passive process, that, you know, the radicalization fairy hits them on the head with the wand and they become radical, and then suddenly they get de-radicalized in the same way and they're back to normal. I'm convinced that you can't take ideas out of people's heads, and it would be undesirable to do so. Those people are entitled to their views. I think that they're wrong. I think that they're unreasonable, but they're entitled to hold those views. And in the meantime, the rest of us can get on with building reasonable platforms to have reasonable discussions like GB News.
It's interesting what you're suggesting, that actually those who have a more commonsensical approach to life just haven't been mobilizing, effectively because I suppose it was taken for granted, right? Would that be why? I mean, to take the best, I mean, I think the Free Speech Union is an excellent example. And the reaction to the formation of the Free Speech Union was very interesting. So I think what Toby Young has done there is a really excellent thing. And yet he came under a lot of flack when he did it, and people were mocking the idea that it was necessary. Well, I mean, no one's mocking it now. It's been completely, well, some people are, but, you know, they haven't been paying attention. It's been completely vindicated, the necessity for this organisation. So many people's lives have been pulled out of the gutter. People who have been targeted unfairly by cancel culture. The evidence is now in, I suppose, and you have obviously been a part of the Free Speech Union. It must feel very gratifying to see that you're actually doing something to help.
It's one of the most incredible things that I've ever been a part of, and seeing the work that my colleagues do, particularly on the case team, it's incredible to see. And most people don't have this perspective because they'll get snippets of it here and there, but the sheer number of normal everyday people, train drivers, teachers, you know, not high profile people like J.K. Rowling, who are falling afoul of cancel culture and need help. They need help to work through the legal process or the employment process and all of these things. And I think it's really important that, as you were saying about people mobilizing in response to these things, it's the same as with you know, if we're going to talk about geopolitics and everything that's happening with China and Russia, that for a long time we sat on our laurels and assumed that it was the end of history. So we could all just assume that democracy was the end point, and that through trade with China and Russia that they would become liberal democracies too, and that was that, and everything was settled, which is so hubristic. I think we've done the same thing when it comes to our own culture as well, that we have totally sort of not abandoned the defense of democracy, but assumed that it would take care of itself. And the majority of people are not like us. They're not people who are constantly looking at all of these stories and hunting them out and talking constantly about everything that's going on. The majority of normal everyday people are getting on with their lives. They have families, they have jobs. They don't necessarily want to be political because, unlike what the activists say, they, as totalitarians do, they like to believe that everything is politicized. Everything in life doesn't have to be politicized, and the majority of people are not political unless they absolutely have to be. But unfortunately now, people really do have to be political. And I think a lot of these issues, whether it's around gender, just the same as it was with Brexit, have made people sit up and notice that something is going on, and that they need to be a part of fixing that and shifting the balance of power back in the direction of the majority of people's thinking. And so I think that this, in a way, is a beautifully conservative, almost Burkean thing, that little platoons are coming together and setting about trying to mend the fabric of civil society and to rebuild institutions that give them a voice out of necessity, because just needs must.
Well, they have to, don't they? Because the culture war is something that most people can no longer afford to ignore, because they've been forced to confront the reality of it. I mean, for a long time, one of the major criticisms that I would get when I was talking about these things is just ignore them. Just they'll go away if you just ignore them. It doesn't matter. This doesn't affect my life. No one's ever asked me to declare my pronouns at work, etc., etc. I've never done an unconscious bias training session. Well, you know, it's only a matter of time. And I think what you said about the Free Speech Union, part of the reason why it was so easy to dismiss it was because the evidence of how widespread this problem was simply wasn't there. Mm-hmm. Now it is. And of course, a lot of the cases that you deal with at the Free Speech Union won't be publicised, won't make the newspapers. And so people can still, at the moment, live in a world where they think that isn't really happening. Mm-hmm. And then you get these denials of cancel culture. But those denials are getting quieter, aren't they?
Yeah, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to deny that there's a problem. It's the same with what we've been seeing in recent weeks in women's sports. It's become almost impossible and, in a way, almost unfashionable to deny that there is a problem there, because it's obvious that this poses a risk to women's sport and is unfair on women. And it's given an increased public awareness to an issue that before perhaps was a little bit niche, that some people could ignore and say wasn't as serious as people were saying it is. And it was you were saying with the Free Speech Union, what is publicly known is the tip of the iceberg. And there'll be many people around the country who are self-censoring, who feel silenced. There was a policy exchange report some years ago looking at censorship within academia. And it was clear that, academics are also living in this stifling climate when it comes to their expression. The same with John Holbrook recently, and the case to do with free speech for barristers. In every walk of life, people are
Artists
facing
as well.
Exactly,
Same thing.
But particularly in the artistic world, people are really finding it creatively as well as intellectually stifling, and having to hold their views in secret, which is a soul destroying and totalitarian experience. And I remember not that long ago I was reading this brilliant book called Reading Lolita in Tehran, and she's talking about the experience under the Iranian regime, and this lady had set up a book club for students to come together and read verboten literature like Nabokov and others. And she talks about how a person would have to have their private self and their public self, and her description of living under totalitarianism, Nabokov's Invitation to a Beheading, so many books that explore these sorts of themes perfectly describe people's experience in all sorts of different industries, from train drivers to famous authors like J.K. Rowling. And I think that is something that is very concerning and is going to become almost impossible for people to deny in the coming years as well. It's the same with the debate around statues and heritage. I was involved in setting up Save Our Statues, which was an organisation intended to help protect heritage. And that was because people on the ground were concerned about their statues in their local town. If people can remember Baden-Powell's statue, when they wanted to take that down, locals came out and practically fought people off from taking their statue away. Because this is what happens when the phenomenon comes for the things that you love and for the things
that in Blackpool, I think, was the Baden-Powell statue.
Paul? I think it was in Poole.
I knew there
somewhere
was a pool
in the south, I think.
Okay.
But this is what happens when this phenomenon comes for the things that you love. We can call it cancel culture, but I think it's something far greater and more sophisticated and actually more worrying than that term can encapsulate.
Well,
and it is coming for, in a sense, in a Scrutonian sense, your home, the things that you hold with great affection. And I think when that happens, that's when people will sit up and realise that they need to take part in the pushback.
And it seems endless. I mean, at GBNews, we are reporting on statues being removed weekly, really, because the campaign groups that are wanting to do this, firstly, they've got a list of the statues they want to target, and there are many, many more to come. And they have institutional power. They appear to have the complete support of people such as Sadiq Khan. Whenever we see public consultations regarding statues, in almost every case, the public overwhelmingly reject the idea that the statue should be modified or removed or anything.
And then very often they take it down anyway.
And they do it anyway, and it's just ignored. So there we have, if we want to talk about institutional power, isn't that where it lies? Yeah,
and I think as well that it's so much of this, as you were saying, is about language. And it's about what people say rather than what they do. And when it comes to historical figures as well, Livingstone is a perfect example of this.
So this is in Glasgow, right?
Glasgow City Council released another, should we call it a hit list, of naughty statues.
Yeah.
And Livingstone, who spent his life campaigning for the abolition of slavery, was put on this list just simply because as a child he worked in a cotton mill.
Yes, and
child labour as well.
Right. He's sort of the victim there, I would suggest.
You would think, but no, he's implicated in slavery. There's the same with Rostat, Tobias Rostat, whose memorial was disputed in Cambridge, and recently that case was also won in favour of keeping the memorial in place. These tenuous links that people, these activists will find between these individuals.
Can you talk me through that though? Because there was also the bust of Thomas Henry Huxley at Imperial College, another explicitly anti-slavery abolitionist figure. How is it that why is it that these activists, rather than just focusing on Edward Colston or the slave traders, are now trying to problematise those who abolished slavery?
This is the word magic again, and I to be very cynical about it, I would say that it's the same as with trying to cancel people's speech, that if you go for the people who are saying the most innocuous things, then that will really terrify everyone. And so if you can get the statues taken down of those who campaigned for the abolition of slavery on the basis that those people are also white supremacists. And why are they white supremacists? Well, because they participated in structural oppression. They lived at a time and were operating at a time when they were participating in white supremacy, and therefore are tarred by association simply almost by being born as a powerful white man in a particular period of history. And so by association, absolutely everything. Same with when they tried to remove the statues. I believe it was the British Library. They wanted to remove the statues of Beethoven and Mendelssohn. Going for Beethoven, Mendelssohn, and abolitionists over, say, statues of people who were, overtly terrible, like Hitler. That sends a message of power, I think.
Right.
And it is a terrifying one. And that's why when I think people who get cancelled, particularly feminists, get cancelled for saying something that everybody pretty much around the country believes, it sends shivers down everyone's spines and makes them shut up. And so whether it's being done consciously or not, I think that also perhaps has something to do with power.
So how do we address that? Because if it is the case that the public are going to be ignored, this is an anti-democratic process. Statues are going to come down, streets are going to be renamed, whether we like it or not, all of which was predicted in 1984, by the way. It's as though they're following it as a guidebook. Yeah. And it's become a cliche, but it's an unavoidable one now. So this is very much a top-down thing, it seems to me. How can you possibly do anything about that if they're willing to dispense with the idea of democratic process?
I wish that there was a solution in Orwell to the problem, because I remember as well at the time. It ends
before the solution comes. Yeah.
Exactly. The solution is just that your face gets eaten by rats.
Yeah.
I remember when Sadiq Khan actually launched his statue commission, that I wrote a piece for The Spectator referring to that particular quote from 1984.
Yeah, every street will be renamed.
Every book will be rewritten, and didn't even realise at the time how true that was going to be. I was referring specifically to the statue review, but since we've seen people like Clancy having to rewrite her, Kate Clancy having to rewrite her own memoirs, to rewrite her memories essentially.
Yes.
And all of these, books and authors that have been cancelled or had their books pulled and all of these things. I don't know what the solution is, but I do think that firstly, small civil society action is important. So in local areas, there have been a number of successes, whether it is to do with free speech or it is to do with heritage, actually setting up campaigning organisations and pushing back and making sure that there are alternative voices, simply being able to say, well, you took this statue down even though all of these people objected. Well, you have to get those people to know that it's happening in the first place, to be able to object, so that you can at least hold them to account when they remove the statue without a democratic mandate. Yes. And having those things on record, not allowing them to erase our memories of these places. So, to make a very extreme comparison, everybody's been talking recently about the heritage destruction in Ukraine.
Yes.
And it's understood that heritage and the protection of heritage is something that is very important to people's national identity. And I think that's how the majority of people feel around the country when they're talking about the statues and street names in their own areas. Those things are there for a particular reason, and they mark the sort of threads of our history in the physical landscape. And it's very important that those things are not erased. So anything that local people can do to remember and commemorate, anything that is removed, anything that is renamed, and to try and organise, whether it's in your local council, in your local area, by making new campaigns or joining existing campaigns like the Free Speech Union or Save Our Statues or any of these other groups, that they find ways for their voices to be heard. And I'm loath to suggest it because I don't think it's a good idea for society to be so politicised. But I also don't think there's another way. I think that people need to participate as much as possible and to be as aware as they can be. And GBNews is fantastic in informing people about these things because they won't be informed on any of the other, like the BBC, for example. They won't be getting a proper view on all of those statues. You say you report on them every single week. Other channels are not doing that. So I think, being aware of what's going on and trying to organise in response to things is pretty much the only solution I can think of for now. If I come up with a better one,
well,
I'll be
someone
sure
has
to let you know.
Does this relate to something about our culture to go back to what we were talking about, offence culture at the start, that the fact that if a few people are upset by the presence of a statue, then to object to that is almost to be seen to challenge someone's lived experience, and so therefore we should be making decisions on the basis of someone's hurt feelings. Because I can imagine, when some of the activists talk about Cecil Rhodes and the statue of Cecil Rhodes, and when they say, when I see that statue, I feel physically punched, I feel violated. Whether that's disingenuous, it might be. It's a pretty good tactic if you want to get your way. On the other hand, maybe they do feel upset because slavery is horrible. And even though they themselves would not have experienced it, maybe they do feel some kind of connection with ancestors who did. Is that not a possibility?
I think the problem is the radical subjectivism of it. So this was the case with the Tobias Rustat Memorial in Cambridge, that an email was sent around describing Rustat, and as with many other historical figures, it's not factually accurate. And actually that's one of the reasons why they left the memorial in place, is because the accusations or the attempts to try and remove the memorial were based on feelings and misrepresented facts. They wasn't factual. It was in it, but it wasn't quite made up either.
Yes.
It's that they felt that he was a slaver, and therefore he was a slaver.
But he either was or he wasn't, right?
Exactly. And so I think for many people who are of a particular mindset, it doesn't matter particularly what the specific facts are. That if people feel offended by something, and they feel offended by something, say by association with slavery, the details of that person's life, maybe they don't even look into it. I'm not sure.
Well, they're perfectly willing to lie. I've seen outright lies about historical figures in order to, even the way that people talk about the Stonewall riots and say it was predominantly trans people who participated, it was a trans riot. Not true. Just factually not true, and that's verifiable. It
was the same with the Cecil Rhodes statue as well, that facts will be mixed in with generally misleading narratives about all of these different historical figures. Baden Powell, another person who has been completely misrepresented, and we now have, another example of a fantastic organisation, History Reclaimed, historians having to come out and debunk the myths that are being peddled about these individuals in order to try and justify why these statues ought to be taken down. And as I say, some of the most absolutely tenuous links. It was the same in the National Trust's report, where they listed Churchill's house and Wordsworth's house, using the most tenuous links that they could possibly have arrived at in order to show why these individuals needed to be unpersoned, to use an Orwellian term.
You get this from academics as well, who I suppose rely on the fact that people will be nervous about challenging their expertise, but of course that gives them a shield, and they are able to lie, misrepresent. It's very easy to smear someone who lived 300 years ago, because you'll be able to find, look, I could smear anyone. You can find something on anyone, right? But particularly if they come from an era in which slavery was not deemed to be a problem, shall we say.
And it's interesting as well, because this is a point that Charles Moore has made, that Cambridge is quite happy to take money from China. But they're more interested in going after somebody who died hundreds of years ago and isn't capable of defending themselves. And I think that, in many of these cases, it's the same with academic culture and the way that they use language often. I think people, and Orwell wrote about this as well in his essay on politics in the English language, they'll use language that is obfuscating and complicated so that everybody is in awe of them and confused, and they won't put their points across clearly. And I think that there is a culture among some activists of using this sort of word magic, jargon-laden, exclusive. I think someone has described it as being like barbed wire around their ideology, so that people can't understand them, are confused by them, but feel in awe of them because they state it with such authority. And when an enormous group of people are stating something that is not factually true so forcefully,
yes,
many people who want to hitch themselves onto a cause that they believe is on the right side of history will overlook the ignorance or the lies about that historical figure because they believe that it is in aid of a greater cause, and so maybe they're willing to overlook that.
So is the solution in clarity of expression? For instance, with History Reclaimed, if they can convey the basic facts about these figures in an accessible way, they'll probably win.
I think that is another thing that people can do that I think is really important, particularly students as well. If the students at university read Orwell's essay on politics in the English language and express yourself plainly,
yes,
you try to stay clear of abstracts as much as possible. Try to communicate with the other person, and in a way, this is a psychological point, because I think we really are living in an age of narcissism and egotism. To speak in a way that doesn't focus on your own ego and your own power and imposing yourself on those around you, but to communicate in a way that is fair-minded and is intended to communicate. So you are actually trying to have a conversation with the other person and listen to them, and you approach it with an air of humility, and you speak with as much clarity as possible. I think that can be a very good anecdote, so that if somebody is coming at you with all of this shower of nonsense, ask them what they mean, question them, use the Socratic method to try and break down exactly what they mean. And perhaps they'll get angry and they'll storm off because they don't like being questioned, and being questioned is white supremacism. Yes. But at least you're starting to expose them to the possibility of being asked those questions.
But it gets back to the point that a lot of them will refuse to be asked those questions. They won't engage in the first place. So,
and will respond hysterically, probably.
Yes, exactly.
And it takes a lot of courage to do that as well, because as I was saying, there's a very big cost for many people, and particularly if you're a student, or if you're an academic, or if you want promotion, or you work in a particular industry, if you work in the arts, the costs can be absolutely massive by even simply asking questions. Asking questions can be seen as aggressive.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to do those things anyway, and in any way that you can, to participate in proper discussions, and importantly to know what you think, because it's very, very difficult to confuse a person who's really given things a lot of thought themselves.
How do you think, or what sort of condition are we in terms of the younger generation, in terms of people who are often written off as being sort of blindly following this ideology or snowflake? I don't think that's true. I think there's a lot of hope among young people who are questioning. But that's just my experience of talking to people at universities and things. Where do you think we're at?
I swing between pessimism and optimism.
Right.
The polls are not necessarily that promising when it comes to the younger generation. I'm aware that I myself have got myself into not an echo chamber as such, but I'm surrounded by people who do live by Enlightenment values to some degree. The generation younger than myself, I think that there are lots of concerns around technology and the use of social media and things like that make it very, very difficult for young people. They're essentially in a new frontier, and that has all sorts of implications for the values that we're discussing. So I want to be optimistic about human nature, and I want to be optimistic about younger people's ability to grapple with the challenges that lie ahead.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure whether not just in this country, but particularly in the United States, I think that a lot of the activism that we see, particularly around the climate as well, there is a crisis of reason, and that concerns me.
But then how do we tackle the idea of all of this kind of these changes that we're seeing being implemented in society are being interpreted as progress? Mm-hmm. But change and progress are not the same thing, and they're being confused. And actually a lot of this stuff is very, very regressive. How do we challenge that narrative that it is just the age-old thing? Every generation sort of partly resents the one that comes after it, and that's true. Mm-hmm. And as we get older, we do struggle with the fact that we are living in a world that is dissimilar to the world we knew, mm-hmm. and that is inevitable and not necessarily a bad thing. But what is happening, I feel, is that anyone who is attempting to push back on this very regressive anti-enlightenment movement is being pigeonholed as just reactionary.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I know that's not the case.
I think the problem is that subtlety and honesty often don't sell very well.
Right, okay.
And with technology, as with almost everything, there are pros and cons, and we do seem to be living in an age where it's more difficult than perhaps it was in the past to discuss things with subtlety and fairness and honesty. Even if you look at BBC archive footage of children talking in the 1960s, they sound more sophisticated than our politicians do now.
They do.
And it's remarkable. And so I think, so there was a report released by Ofsted, I believe it was last week, discussing particularly the use of masks during lockdown and the impact of lockdown on children's development. And one of the findings was that children have been sat in front of the television for so long that they've started imitating the accents and voices of the people they see on television, right, rather than the people that they see in the world. And I think that all of that atomization and social media is kind of like the pool of Narcissus, and everybody is stuck to it. I think people need to somehow take responsibility for themselves, to take themselves away from those things. And I know that this is an impossible recommendation.
Yeah.
I don't know how we change culture to be more healthy in relation to these things.
Well, we can't put the genie back in the bottle there.
No.
I think the social media is
We need
there.
to take personal responsibility, because I think one of the concerns that I have is that the government and social media companies, to take one example, think that the solution is to try and limit the platform, is to try and remove the speech that they don't like, things that they call legal but harmful to adults. They believe that there are certain things on these platforms that are psychologically harmful, perhaps because they might offend you. Putting trigger warnings on things is another example. I think that we need to somehow foster a culture of individual responsibility when it comes to these things, to view them as tools. And perhaps that's something that needs to be, dealt with partly through education,
right,
with young people. But ultimately, I have absolutely no idea what the solution is.
Well,
to
also,
this problem.
Mostly because this, if we call it the counter-enlightenment, let's call it that, the values of the counter-enlightenment appear to have infected all sides of the political spectrum. You've mentioned mm-hmm. yourself the Conservative Party pushing through their online safety bill, their protest bill. They don't seem to trust adults. Mm-hmm. They don't seem to push the idea of personal responsibility, which I would assume should be one of their core values as a Conservative Party. So with woke politics now, its tentacles reaching out into every major institution, cultural, political, educational, law enforcement, media, everywhere, Conservative, Labour, mm-hmm. Lib Dem, there's nowhere left to go, is there? Where do people like you sit politically now?
I have no idea where I sit politically anymore. I regard myself as being small c conservative, particularly after COVID, as being much more liberal than I believed that I was before COVID. Right. I imagine that I'm probably politically homeless in the way that most people around the country will be after all of the upheaval of the last couple of years. But I think one thing that can be done is, I mentioned institution building. I think people can find a home amongst like-minded people. It's just simply that the old institutions that people would have flocked to are no longer the right home for that. And I think that to be optimistic, people are starting to organise themselves and come together with others who are like-minded. And we're living through a period of so much political, technological upheaval and change in absolutely every sphere of life, whether it's social media, privacy, public health policy, even the philosophical underpinnings of the divisions within our politics between left and right. We used to talk about the Great Realignment, and that feels like it was 100 years ago now. I think that things are going to take many, many decades to realign themselves, and the only way that I can imagine that taking a more positive form is through people finding others who think in similar terms, and having, as I say, having these discussions, and living by the values that are important, by actually, forget what you say or what you signal about what you believe, actually living the lives and behaving in a manner that demonstrates the values that you hold, actions rather than words. And I think that could go a long way to at least creating a sort of a firm basis for future institutions to be built.
And you mentioned education in regard to this, but isn't that the problem, that education in of itself, this is why activists are going after educators now and often describe themselves as educators. This is why the largest teaching union, the National National Education Union, is saying we need to decolonise curricula at every level. It's saying we need more activism in the classroom. We need more teachers to be activists. It's now an activist body.
Yeah.
Now, that's going to... all of the things that you're describing, I'm completely on board with. And the idea, if we can make those changes in society, that would be great. I don't think it's possible if young people are captured too early.
I think people like Calvin Robinson, Catherine Birbal Singh have done fantastic work in trying to raise awareness of the issues in education. And I think that there are individual teachers who could in some way perhaps be empowered to try to resist these sorts of things, but it's a very difficult one.
It's hard,
because
though.
It is hard, and the government have attempted, with different degrees of success, because I think that the current government's record on these things is quite mixed. On the one hand, there's the online safety bill, but on the other, there is the free speech bill in relation to academia and higher education, and I think it
seems a bit schizophrenic, those two things. They don't seem...
I think that the government are in the process of working out what their approach is.
Right.
The problem is that we are so behind in terms of how far this has progressed through our institutions. So education, yes, but also our museums and those who are the custodians of our cultural heritage, adding plaques and descriptions to works of art, and having gallery exhibitions that are completely one-sided and view our history and our culture and everything through only one specific lens.
And end up berating the artist for most of the time about their sins.
Because all of them are sinners in their eyes. And it's a difficult one, because ultimately questions of how to foster a different culture when we've let it slip so far is always going to be a difficult one. And the practical solutions that we can offer are not going to be clear cut, because I think it's going to take a lot of time, people working these things out and forming different organizations. Some will survive, some will not. Some will do good work for many, many years. Some will do good work for a very short period of time. And I don't know what clear-cut solutions there can be, particularly in education. That is a really difficult one.
A teacher friend of mine who often sends me screenshots of the email he's had from the heads of department, or the latest presentation they've been given about structural racism or unconscious bias or something. They even had a day at his school where the black children were taken aside to ask for their feelings about what it's like to be black at the school. I'm sure some of them were thinking,
it's like Eton College having the boys put a pillow underneath their tops to simulate pregnancy.
I didn't know about this.
They call the trendy Hendy, I think, is the name.
What was the purpose of that?
It was some kind of probably diversity workshop.
Okay.
And I think we don't know what's going on.
No, that's
within
it.
our schools. We don't know what the scale of this problem is. And one thing that could be, a solution, at least on a small scale, is that if parents are aware that these sorts of things are happening in schools throughout the country, there needs to be a way for parents to hold those schools to account and to be aware of what their children are being taught, and to let their opinion be known, to be involved in become a school governor, find ways to involve yourself in your child's education, involve yourself in your local community in any ways that you can, so that you are at least aware of these things when they're happening, and that there is a voice to push back against them. Because it's also a solution against groupthink. A lot of the time, I don't think necessarily that everybody who's involved in these sorts of things, they're all true believers. Many people you would say would be woke adjacent, that they want to do the right thing. They're nice, good people. They are living normal lives. They haven't thought about this in any great intellectual depth. And they want to be, as I say, they want to be on the right side of history. And they believe that if somebody says to them that Black Lives Matter is the heir to the civil rights movement, of course they're going to want to go along with it if they're not aware of all of the details about what that organization entails.
Yeah.
And so I think just simply finding ways to present the alternative view, whether it is, as a governor of a school or in any way, to just involve yourself as much as you can within civil society and within your local community, has got to go some way in pushing back against it.
And so actually ultimately to challenge people of power like that, it's going to have to be through the courts, isn't it?
I think that the most territory will be gained by challenging these things through the courts. Harry Miller was a perfect example of that. There'll be others, Maya Forstater also. Although I think that some of these, not to say that they're Pyrrhic victories, because they're not, they're very important victories. But I think it's always important to recognise that the battle is not won. Also, the war is not won, even though the battles have been won. But in the case with Maya Forstater, which I think it was a really incredible victory, found that basically gender critical beliefs are protected. What, you mean the statement of biological facts? Yes, but we're allowed to do that by law. This is exactly what I mean when I say that we have to look at these. We have to not get sucked into the worldview with the way that we look at these victories and the details of them, because the protection of gender critical beliefs as a philosophical belief, to me, seems absurd, because, as you say, it's a statement of biological fact. These are not beliefs. This is a statement of fact. And so it seems crazy that the only way that we can defend these things, and that the most strategic way to defend these things, is by saying that this is a philosophical belief that is protected. I see. But I think that in itself shows that we've got ourselves into a bit of a bind. Yeah. But nonetheless, these are victories that are taking us in the right direction, one step at a time. And every single case that is taken to court and is won, and every person who goes through the employment tribunals, or if you're a barrister, if you've gone through the process that the barristers have to go through, there's an arbitration tribunal that they go through. I think that every single one of these is a step in the right direction, but ultimately the battle is going to be won through a combination of that with cultural change. And I think the only way to achieve that cultural change is through creating platforms where people can have free discussions and free speech, and by organisations like the Free Speech Union and others redressing that balance and removing the costs of speaking freely, and helping to open up spaces where people can have free dialogue and can express themselves in a way that is absolutely legitimate in a free and democratic society, but has been withheld from many people in so many different spheres of life. Emma Webb, thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you for having me. This has been the Free Speech Nation podcast with me, Andrew Doyle, and my guest, Emma Webb. Please do follow Emma on Twitter. She's at Emma_A_Webb. You can also check out a lot of her work on the New Culture Forum YouTube channel. And if you enjoyed the show, please do like and subscribe. Join me again next week. I'll have another fabulous guest for you. See you then.